Bram Stoker began life in Dublin in a body that often failed him. As a small child, he spent long stretches confined to bed, watched closely, and kept apart from the normal noise of childhood. Days that should have been filled with play instead became long hours of waiting, waiting to feel stronger, waiting to be allowed up, waiting for the next relapse. It taught him an early lesson. Life could narrow suddenly, without warning. With little else to do, his mind worked. Stories came to him through family, through books, through whatever scraps of news reached the bedside, but imagination did not always comfort him. When the body felt weak, the mind searched for reasons, and fear rushed in to fill the gaps. Illness made him think in extremes, safe or threatened, strong or helpless. That habit stayed. Even as the days passed, a private dread took shape, being powerless. He watched other children move freely while he measured life in small improvements and sudden setbacks. Each recovery felt temporary. Each new ache sounded like proof that weakness could return and take everything. So he began building a different kind of strength, first in thought, then in will. He learned to endure. He learned to observe, and somewhere in that long, quiet struggle, he made himself a promise that mattered. He would outgrow this and never be at the mercy of frailty again. He did not stay the fragile boy people expected. As his strength returned, he pushed himself into the life of a serious student, determined to prove the sickness had not defined him. The change mattered because it opened doors that weakness kept shut. He took exams, built routines, and aimed for steady work. On paper, his future looked practical, it looked safe, and it looked ordinary. That safety came through the civil service, the kind of job that promised a wage and a respectable name. By day, he worked inside rules, forms, and schedules, learning how systems ran and how people protected their positions. But the same mind that followed procedure also searched for escape. After hours, he began writing about theatre, not as a hobby, but as a second occupation he kept quiet. 2 lives ran in parallel. Night after night, he watched performances and judged them with the focus of someone who needed the stage to feel awake. He studied what held a crowd, what broke tension, what made a room turn in unison. The more he wrote, the more he returned, and the more the theatre stopped being entertainment and became compulsion. The civil service paid the bills, but the stage took his attention. It became his new addiction. Stoker's obsession with the stage stopped being a hobby the moment he crossed paths with Henry Irving. Irving was not just an actor. He ran his own productions and commanded attention wherever he went. Stoker admired him with the intense focus of someone who already lived 2 lives and wanted a third. One meeting turned into ongoing contact, and suddenly Stoker faced a real choice. Keep his steady civil service path or gamble everything on Irving thing. Irving offered something Stoker craved: proximity to power, to art, to importance. But it came with conditions that were never written down. Irving expected people around him to work hard, agree quickly, and protect his image without questions. Stoker leaned in anyway. He adjusted his life around Irving's needs, not the other way around. It looked like opportunity. It also became a contract of loyalty, measured in hours and obedience. Stoker's decision bound him to a man who rewarded devotion and punished independence. The more Stoker helped, the more Irving relied on him, and reliance turned into control. Stoker learned when to speak and when to hold things back. He carried tasks, messages, and problems that were not his, because Irving's success demanded a tight circle and a closed mouth. It reshaped Stoker's future. It also trained him in secrecy. In London, Stoker did not just follow Irving, he ran the machine around him. At the Lyceum Theatre, he became the manager who made each production possible, turning Irving's demands into schedules, contracts, and constant decisions. The work multiplied fast. There were rehearsals to organise, staff to manage, money to account for, and problems to solve before the audience ever arrived. His ambition finally had a stage of its own, and it never went dark. The Lyceum did not stay in one place for long. Touring meant travel plans, hotels, trains, publicity, and new theatres with new rules. Every move created fresh risks, and Stoker absorbed them. When Irving performed, Stoker arranged everything that made the performance possible and protected Irving's time as if it mattered more than his own. Days stretched, nights followed, rest became a luxury he postponed because the next opening, the next city, the next crisis already waited. This pace brought status, and it looked like success. But it also turned his body into a ledger of wear and debt. The more reliable he became, the more he was used, and the harder it got to step back. Exhaustion stopped being occasional and started becoming normal. Small illnesses lingered instead of passing. The same drive that lifted him in London also ground him down, quietly laying the groundwork for the chronic decline that followed. Bram Stoker married Florence Balcombe, and on paper his life looked settled. He gained a wife, a home, and soon a child to anchor him. But the timing mattered. His work for Henry Irving already ruled his days and nights, and marriage did not weaken that grip. It added a second set of obligations to a life that already ran on impossible hours. Stoker's job demanded travel, late nights, and constant readiness. That meant Florence often lived with an absence, even when he technically belonged to her. The family rhythm formed around his departures and returns, not around meals or routines. And because Irving's world depended on discretion, Stoker carried work pressures home without fully explaining them. He held back details, and distance grew in the silence. Over time, the marriage absorbed that pattern, duty on the surface, strain underneath. Florence faced long stretches of managing alone, while Stoker moved between two lives that rarely met cleanly. He provided, but he also vanished into theatre demands and private loyalties. Intimacy became harder to protect when so much stayed unspoken. The result was a family shaped less by warmth than by secrecy and emotional caution. While the Lyceum demanded his days, Stoker carved out another job in secret. He researched, he took notes, he hunted for details that felt real enough to scare people who thought they were too modern to be frightened. He read about strange diseases, about blood, and about how quickly a strong body could fail. The old fear from his childhood returned, but this time he aimed it at the page. He worked in stolen hours because his public life left no space for a private obsession. The theatre schedule set the rules, and he followed them, then broke them quietly at night. What he drafted stayed hidden, not because it was illegal, but because it touched subjects polite society avoided. Victorian respectability depended on silence. He wrote about hunger, contamination, and desire, and he kept the manuscript out of sight. The more exhausted he felt, the more the story tightened its grip. His own body became evidence that health could vanish without warning, and he shaped that anxiety into a threat that moved from person to person. He built a tale where infection looked like temptation and weakness looked like guilt. It advanced in fragments, revised between tours and late finishes, until the hidden draft started to resemble a complete novel. In 1897, the book finally came out. After years of private work done around the Lyceum's demands, Bram Stoker saw his vampire story printed and reviewed in public. It drew notice. People talked about it. Some admired its nerve and its new kind of fear. But attention did not equal security. The sales did not turn into steady money. The novel existed. The bills still arrived. So Stoker stayed where he had always stayed, at the theatre, managing everything that kept Henry Irving's world running. The work did not slow down because a book had appeared. If anything, the gap between dream and reality widened. Writing had promised an escape route. Publishing had looked like proof it mattered, but the Lyceum still demanded long days, constant decisions, and loyalty that left little room to recover. And his body kept tally. The exhaustion he had carried for years deepened into something harder to ignore. He worked through it because he had to, and because stopping risked everything he depended on. The novel did not buy him freedom, and it did not buy him health. It became one more achievement he carried on his back. The cost of his career turned visible, and it kept rising. The Lyceum years did not end with a clean curtain call. The business slowed, the old certainty cracked, and Stoker's position began to look less like a career and more like a trap that no longer paid for itself. Then Henry Irving died. With him went the one connection that had anchored Stoker's status, routine, and access to work. Overnight, the system that had kept him moving stopped holding him up. What followed did not look like freedom. It looked like exposure. Without Irving's machine around him, Stoker had to face the practical question of money, and he had fewer safe ways to answer it. His writing still brought recognition, but recognition did not cover bills. At the same time, his long decline sharpened into something harder to ignore. The illness stayed oddly undefined in public, and that vagueness made every setback feel suspicious. As his strength narrowed, so did his control of the story told about him. People filled the silence with guesses about what had really been wrong, what had really happened in his working life, and what he had really hidden to keep standing. He did not settle the questions. He did not explain the gaps. Instead, he kept going as best he could, pressed by finances and pinned by rumour, watching his private struggle become his public identity. In 1912, Bram Stoker died after years of decline, and his death did not bring closure. It triggered a new kind of struggle. He left behind a name that meant something to readers, but it did not guarantee steady money for the family. His widow, Florence, faced the problem fast. If his work drifted into the public domain in practice, then the last chance at income vanished. Florence moved to control what could still be controlled. She pushed for proper payments, watched publishers closely, and treated every unauthorized copy as a direct threat. Pirated editions and cheap reprints spread anyway, feeding on the fact that Stoker could no longer answer back. Then the stage and early screen adaptations arrived, promising new audiences but also new risks. Each version could reshape Dracula and erase Stoker's authority. So the fight became two battles at once, money and reputation. Florence tried to make adaptations pay, but she also tried to make them behave, to keep the story tied to Stoker's name and not a free-for-all monster. And underneath that public effort sat the private mess Stoker left behind, his debts, his silences, his illness, and the rumours around his life. Protecting the legacy meant protecting the secrets too. Over time, the book outgrew its author. Dracula kept getting retold, reshaped, and sold to new audiences, until Bram Stoker's name became shorthand for a whole kind of monster. He ended up immortal in the simplest way. His creation refused to die. But the more famous the vampire became, the less clear the man behind it looked. His public legacy hardened into a symbol, while his private life stayed unresolved. The questions did not fade with the years. His illness stayed difficult to pin down, leaving a trail of guesses instead of certainty. His closest relationships, including the ones that defined his working life and his home life, remained hard to read from the outside, marked by loyalty, distance, and things left unsaid. Even money, the most concrete part of a life, stayed murky, shaped by pressure, instability, and the constant need to keep going. So the modern image split in two. On one side stood the cultural giant, the man credited with laying the foundation for modern Dracula mythology. On the other stood a person still half hidden, surrounded by gaps that never fully closed. That contrast mattered because it showed what he escaped and what he never did. He left obscurity behind in the world's imagination, but he did not leave clarity behind in his own story.